Hello, viewers. Before we begin, we want to let you know that this is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, events, or places is purely coincidental. We are human storytellers sharing these takes to entertain, inspire, and touch hearts. Viewer discretion is advised.
The day had begun like any other, but there was an unease in the air I couldn't ignore. I had known for months that something had changed in my marriage, small signs, subtle shifts in attention, lingering glances at his phone, and the increasing secrecy surrounding his schedule. Today, however, everything became impossible to overlook. I had arrived home early, hoping for a quiet morning together, only to find him not alone in our shared home. In the living room, sprawled comfortably on our plush sofa, was a woman whose presence made my chest tighten with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She smiled at him in that way I had once believed only I could elicit, the same soft laugh, the same flirtatious tilt of the head that had once belonged to our private jokes. And there I was, standing at the threshold, my hand still on the door handle, feeling every heartbeat pound in my ears. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, my body frozen in the tension between what I had known and what I had now seen. He glanced at me, caught between surprise and irritation, as if my presence were inconvenient, an unexpected reminder of the life he had supposedly shared with me. I tried to find my voice, to demand an explanation, but the words lodged stubbornly in my throat. Anger surged, hot and sharp, mingling with heartbreak and betrayal. He hadn't just been unfaithful in a fleeting moment. This was deliberate, prolonged, and blatant. The intimacy he shared with her had replaced the trust and warmth he once reserved for me. I stepped inside anyway, forcing calm over the storm of emotions, because I had to confront him, not as a woman in tears, but as someone who had always demanded respect. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt. The answer didn't come immediately, and in that pause, I realized the enormity of the situation. He was caught off guard, and yet he didn't deny anything. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any confession could. I remembered all the plans we had made together, the life we had built brick by brick. This moment, small in duration but immense in consequence, felt like the shattering of a world I had trusted implicitly. And as I looked at them, their laughter filling the room like a knife twisting in my heart, I understood that this was no accident. He had chosen her over me, not out of weakness, but out of a deliberate preference. Yet even in the depths of my hurt, a spark of resolve ignited. I would not be reduced to despair or silence. This betrayal, raw and humiliating, would become the foundation for the reckoning he had never imagined. The revelation of his betrayal did not remain confined within the walls of our home for long. News travels quickly in the circles we moved in, and as the evening unfolded, I could sense the shift in attention everywhere I went. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives who had previously greeted me with warm smiles now offered polite nods that carried a trace of curiosity and sympathy. The world around me, once familiar and comfortable, had suddenly become a stage where my husband's indiscretions were the topic of hushed whispers. At the gala that evening, the tension was palpable. Guests moved gracefully across the room, yet their eyes kept flicking in my direction. Each glance felt like a question, a silent inquiry about the woman who had been publicly overlooked while the man she had trusted flaunted his infidelity. I maintained composure, keeping my expression neutral, but inside, a whirlwind of emotions churned relentlessly. Anger, humiliation, and disbelief collided with a quiet determination to rise above the spectacle. My husband, meanwhile, attempted to navigate the social scene as though nothing had occurred, but the subtle stares and soft murmurs followed him like shadows. I watched him from a distance, noting the falter in his confidence, the brief hesitation when someone approached to greet him. The once confident aura he carried had diminished, replaced by a faintly noticeable tension. Even his mistress, who had moments ago seemed so comfortable and self-assured, now looked uneasy under the eyes of a society that had started noticing the imbalance, sensing the scandal that hovered like a cloud over our household. Amidst all this, I realized that the silent judgment of society was a force more powerful than confrontation. Each whisper, each subtle glance, amplified the reality of his choices. The betrayal was no longer just personal, it had transformed into a public testament of his character. Yet, within this growing scrutiny, I discovered a peculiar strength. I was no longer merely the wronged wife. I was a figure whose dignity, composure, and presence demanded attention. While he had chosen to betray me, the eyes of the world now bore witness to my silent resolve, and that awareness began to shift the power in the room, imperceptibly at first, but steadily and irrevocably. Just as the whispers and uneasy glances began to settle, the evening took an even more dramatic turn. The Duke, a man whose authority and presence commanded immediate attention, rose from his seat at the head of the grand hall. The murmurs of conversation quieted instantly, replaced by a tense anticipation that spread through the crowd like wildfire. All eyes turned toward him, including my husband's, whose expression shifted from smug confidence to visible alarm. The Duke's voice, calm and deliberate, carried clearly across the room. As of today, I am officially transferring the responsibilities of my kingdom to my brother. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Guests gasped softly, their reactions mingling shock, curiosity, and speculation. Some reached for their companions' arms, whispering hurried questions, while others simply stared, frozen in disbelief. My husband's jaw tightened, and I could sense the creeping realization of what this meant. The power he had assumed over the evening, and perhaps over my life, was crumbling before his eyes. The grandeur of his schemes, the confidence he carried while flaunting his mistress, now seemed trivial compared to the authority the Duke wielded with a single sentence. I watched as the Duke continued, describing the reasons for his decision with quiet gravitas. He spoke of family, trust, and duty, but his words also carried a subtle sting aimed at those who had underestimated the consequences of ambition without loyalty. Every word resonated in the room, reinforcing the sense of upheaval. My husband's unease grew, evident in the way he shifted his weight, glanced nervously at the crowd, and avoided my gaze. Meanwhile, I stood tall, heart steady, sensing that the tides had turned not just in my personal life, but in the broader court of influence and power that surrounded us. The room, filled with nobles, dignitaries, and influential figures, now focused not on the trivial drama of romantic betrayal, but on the monumental decision of the Duke. Yet, the irony was unmistakable. My husband, who had spent the evening flaunting his mistress as if to assert control, now found himself overshadowed completely. The world had shifted, and he was no longer the center of attention. I, on the other hand, experienced a quiet vindication. Standing beside him, poised and dignified, I realized that power, authority, and respect were not earned through deception or selfish pleasure. They came from composure, presence, and patience. The murmurs of the crowd began to transform into whispers of admiration directed at me. Though unspoken, their recognition was palpable. They saw me not as a wronged wife, but as a woman who had endured betrayal with grace, whose dignity had not faltered even in the shadow of public humiliation. My husband's mistake had unwittingly elevated my position in the eyes of the room. The Duke's pronouncement had shifted the evening's narrative entirely, and I understood, with a quiet certainty, that from this moment forward, I was no longer a passive figure in my own life. As the Duke's words echoed through the hall, my husband's composed facade began to crumble. Every confident step he had taken that evening, every smug glance toward his mistress, now seemed hollow under the weight of public scrutiny and the sudden shift in authority. His eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for allies or distractions, yet no one offered the reassurance he had counted on. The atmosphere that had once seemed entirely under his control now felt suffocating, each glance from the assembled guests a reminder of his diminishing stature. I could see him struggling internally. The mixture of panic, embarrassment, and disbelief painted his face in ways he could not conceal. His mistress, once a symbol of his triumph and audacity, mirrored his unease, Her confidence faltered as she noticed the subtle but unmistakable change in how others viewed them. It became clear that the prestige and power he had flaunted so carelessly were meaningless without the support of recognition, respect, and authority. Things he had assumed were assured by proximity to influence rather than earned through virtue or foresight. I maintained my composure deliberately. Standing tall, my posture radiating calm and confidence, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. While he had chosen deception and betrayal, I had chosen dignity and patience. His shock was now magnified by my presence, me, the woman he had once ignored, standing silently yet powerfully beside him as the crowd's attention gradually shifted toward me. Every whispered speculation and every sidelong glance seemed to emphasize the contrast between us. I was no longer the hidden, wronged wife. I had become a visible embodiment of resilience and poise. As his confusion grew, my own thoughts remained clear. I reflected on how the tables had turned. The very man who had sought to assert control over me through infidelity was now the one rendered powerless by circumstance. The Duke's decision, the whispers of society, and the subtle acknowledgement of my presence collectively dismantled his carefully constructed image. His pride, which had fueled his audacity to choose another over me, now became his greatest vulnerability. Every moment I stood beside him, observing the realization unfold in his eyes, reinforced a profound truth. Power, respect, and influence cannot be claimed through selfishness or deceit. They are granted only to those who demonstrate grace, foresight, and integrity. My husband had overlooked this simple principle, and now he faced the consequences publicly, while I stood firmly, silently asserting my own strength and worth. The hall, once a place of his assumed dominance, had quietly but unmistakably recognized the shift. The mistress, who had spent the evening basking in my husband's attention, finally began to notice the shift in the room. At first, she smiled nervously, pretending that nothing had changed, but the subtle whispers of the guests and the way their eyes now lingered on me rather than her began to unnerve her. She had entered the evening with a sense of triumph, believing that she had secured not only his affection but also the admiration of those around us. Yet, as the Duke's declaration and the growing awareness of the crowd unfolded, her confidence began to crumble. Her attempts to regain composure were noticeable. She adjusted her dress, laughed a little too loudly at a passing joke, and tried to catch my husband's attention with flirtatious glances. Each gesture, however, fell flat. The room's focus had shifted, and the subtle dynamics of power that she had hoped to exploit were no longer hers to command. I could see her realization dawning, the awareness that she had been invited into a life built on manipulation and illusion, only to find herself standing on unstable ground. I observed her with a quiet, measured gaze. There was no need for confrontation. Her unease was evident enough. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in that instant, the message was unmistakable. She understood that the evening had not gone according to her plans. I had remained composed, unshaken by betrayal, while she struggled to maintain an illusion of control that was rapidly dissolving. The contrast between us was stark and undeniable. Meanwhile, my husband's attempts to reassure her only amplified the tension. He leaned closer, whispered hurriedly, and gestured nervously, all while the room's perception of him continued to shift. The mistress could feel it. Her position was precarious, dependent entirely on a man whose credibility and authority were now publicly questioned. The realization struck her with subtle but undeniable force. She was not in command of this narrative. I was. By the time the Duke's announcement fully sank in among the guests, the mistress had lost much of the confidence she had flaunted. Her laughter became hollow, her posture tense, and her attempts at charm ineffective. In the subtle theater of social power and perception, she had been outmaneuvered, and she knew it. The room, which had been a stage for her perceived victory, now silently acknowledged the true balance of influence. While my husband had chosen betrayal, the dignity, patience, and quiet authority I carried had become the defining force of the evening. As the realization of my husband's misjudgment settled over the room, the Duke's brother, an equally poised and authoritative figure, stepped forward. His presence was commanding, yet measured, as though he carried the weight of responsibility lightly, knowing precisely the effect his actions would have on the gathering. The guests immediately shifted their attention, recognizing the gravity of the moment. The Duke's transfer of the kingdom was no mere ceremonial gesture. It signified the deliberate redistribution of power, and the subtle consequences rippled across every corner of the ballroom. My husband's unease grew exponentially as he noticed the way the Duke's brother engaged with the audience. Each nod, each courteous smile, and every well-measured word carried authority and respect. Unlike my husband, who relied on appearances and manipulation to assert dominance, the Duke's brother exuded a natural command, an unspoken understanding that influence and loyalty were earned through integrity, foresight, and genuine leadership. His very presence highlighted the contrast between what my husband thought he controlled and the reality he could not influence. I observed silently, my posture calm and assured. The power dynamics of the room had shifted completely. My husband, who had once been the center of attention, was now a man caught between humiliation and disbelief, watching as a family decision unfolded in public that affected the kingdom, his status, and indirectly, his social image. It became increasingly clear that his choices, particularly the audacity of prioritizing a mistress over his wife, were now irrelevant in the face of authority, respect, and strategic family decisions that operated far beyond his narrow vision. The Duke's brother addressed the crowd with deliberate clarity, articulating the responsibilities he was about to assume and the commitment he would uphold in carrying forward the legacy. The guests responded with a mixture of admiration and approval, their whispers acknowledging the integrity and decisiveness of his leadership. My husband's nervous glances at me betrayed an unspoken understanding. He had been outmatched not only socially but morally and strategically as well. Meanwhile, the mistress's earlier confidence began to dissolve further. She fidgeted subtly, her eyes darting toward my husband for reassurance, only to find him increasingly paralyzed by the unfolding reality. I, however, remained a figure of composure and quiet authority. The crowd's perception was shifting naturally, without my intervention, proof that dignity, patience, and self-respect resonated more profoundly than deceit or selfish ambition. By the time the Duke's brother finished addressing the assembly, it was undeniable. The evening's narrative had been rewritten. My husband, who had so brazenly betrayed me, was now overshadowed by forces of authority and principle that neither he nor his mistress could manipulate. Standing beside him, silently observing the unfolding respect and admiration directed my way, I realized that the power of composure, integrity, and patience was far more influential than any act of deception could ever be. By the time the Duke's brother had concluded his remarks, the weight of the evening's events had fully sunk in for my husband. The humiliation that had been building subtly over the course of the night now pressed down on him like a physical force. His carefully constructed image of charm, control, and superiority had been dismantled completely, leaving him exposed to the judgment of everyone around him. Every polite smile, every averted glance, and every whisper in the room seemed to magnify the reality he had ignored, that his actions had consequences far beyond the private walls of our home. I could see it in his posture, slightly hunched, hands fidgeting, and eyes darting nervously. The confidence he had flaunted just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a tense, almost desperate awareness of the attention his betrayal had garnered. Even his mistress, once so assured in her assumed position of power, now mirrored his unease. The room's subtle acknowledgement of my composure and quiet authority contrasted sharply with the visible discomfort of the two people who had believed they could manipulate the evening to their advantage. I remained still, my expression calm and controlled, fully aware of the effect I was having on the room. Every guest now perceived me not as a passive, wronged wife, but as a woman who had endured betrayal with dignity and strength. I did not need to speak. My presence alone communicated the depth of my resilience. The whispers that once carried speculation about my husband's conquest now shifted toward admiration for my unwavering composure. As the guests continued to observe, I noticed subtle gestures of acknowledgement directed at me. A nod from a noble woman, a discreet smile from a close family friend, even the way certain influential figures turned their attention to me during conversations. All of it reinforced that my standing had increased, not because of power or manipulation, but because of my dignity in the face of betrayal. Meanwhile, my husband's discomfort intensified. He realized that the very actions he had believed would elevate him socially, the public display of his mistress, the flaunting of his dominance over me, had instead exposed his flaws and diminished his status. His social leverage had evaporated, leaving him vulnerable and humbled. For the first time, he could see that power, respect, and admiration were not won through selfishness or deception but through integrity, patience, and composure. The night continued, yet for him, the evening had ended the moment the Duke's brother stepped forward, and the room collectively shifted its perception. And as I stood there, calm and unshaken, I recognized a profound truth. Betrayal could wound, but dignity and quiet authority commanded far more power than any deceit ever could. While my husband and his mistress struggled with the unfolding humiliation, I realized that I didn't need to raise my voice or make a dramatic scene. My quiet presence, calm and dignified, was far more effective than any confrontation. Each subtle glance I offered, each poised movement, reinforced the disparity between my composed resilience and their faltering confidence. The room's attention, naturally drawn to grace and strength, was now firmly on me. I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the months of betrayal I had endured. Instead of reacting in anger or lashing out, I had chosen patience and discretion. And now, without a word, my strategy was working. Every guest in the room was aware, whether consciously or not, of the stark contrast between my measured composure and the flustered panic of my husband and his mistress. In that silence, I found my most potent form of revenge: control over the narrative. I noticed subtle shifts among the onlookers. Whispers of sympathy and admiration began to replace the earlier speculative gossip. Influential figures, previously observing from polite distance, now offered discreet acknowledgments of respect, a silent recognition of the quiet power I carried. My husband's attempts to regain control, through whispered explanations to friends or furtive attempts at charm, only reinforced the contrast, highlighting his incompetence in the social arena. The mistress, now acutely aware of her precarious position, tried to maintain composure, but her anxiety was unmistakable. Every movement, every hesitant smile, betrayed her awareness that she had been outmaneuvered without a single word from me. I could see her realizing that the charm and influence she had assumed were superficial, easily overshadowed by genuine dignity and the patience I had maintained throughout our marriage. In that moment, I understood that my revenge did not need to be loud or vengeful. It was quiet, understated, and infinitely more powerful. I had allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally, and in doing so, I had shown that strength, integrity, and calm authority were far more effective than manipulation or deceit. My husband, who had believed he could dominate both me and the room, now faced the undeniable reality. He had been outshone by someone he had consistently underestimated. The room continued to murmur, yet the whispers were no longer about scandal or betrayal. They were about the woman who had endured humiliation with grace, whose quiet authority had reshaped the evening entirely. And in that silent victory, I found not just satisfaction, but a profound sense of empowerment that no betrayal could ever take away. By now, the mistress's earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Her initial triumph, built on the illusion that she had won my husband's attention and, by extension, social influence, was crumbling before her very eyes. The subtle murmurs and glances of the crowd, once flattering, now carried judgment and skepticism. Every small gesture she attempted to maintain her image, adjusting her posture, smiling at influential guests, or leaning toward my husband for reassurance, was met with the silent acknowledgement that her position was no longer secure. I observed her carefully, noting the small but telling signs of panic in her behavior. Her eyes flicked repeatedly toward my husband, as if seeking validation or protection, only to find him increasingly unmoored and anxious. She had assumed that by aligning herself with him, She could manipulate the social narrative, but the reality was now painfully clear. The control she sought was an illusion. The respect, admiration, and influence that mattered in this room were not hers to claim. Meanwhile, my husband's flustered attempts to salvage the evening only magnified the mistress's discomfort. He whispered hastily, gestured awkwardly, and even offered brief, uneasy smiles to placate the crowd. Yet none of it worked. The room's attention had shifted entirely, and the narrative of dominance, charm, and social control that he had relied on had collapsed. I, in contrast, remained calm, composed, and silently authoritative, embodying a quiet strength that drew the admiration and subtle deference of everyone present. The mistress's realization became increasingly evident. She could see the growing contrast between her fleeting, superficial influence and the lasting, tangible authority I now represented. Her power had been contingent entirely on my husband's favor, yet now that favor was meaningless in the face of the room's awareness of truth, integrity, and dignity. I had endured betrayal with patience and grace, and in doing so, I had taken control of the narrative she had tried to dominate. By the end of the evening, the mistress understood fully that she had overestimated her position. The consequences of aligning herself with deceit and self-interest were undeniable, and her attempts at charm and manipulation now seemed almost comical in their futility. In that quiet, unmistakable way, she had been humbled. I, on the other hand, stood poised and unshaken, a testament to the power of patience, integrity, and quiet dignity in the face of betrayal. As the evening drew to a close, the cumulative effects of the Duke's decision, my husband's humiliation, and the mistress's faltering confidence became unmistakable. The entire room had shifted its perception, not through confrontation or loud displays, but through the subtle, undeniable demonstration of composure, integrity, and quiet authority. Every guest now viewed the evening not as a simple scandal, but as a vivid lesson in power, respect, and consequence. My husband, who had once believed he controlled both social perception and private loyalty, now stood exposed. The calculated audacity of choosing a mistress over his wife had failed him spectacularly. The Duke's pronouncement and the public acknowledgement of his brother's rise had realigned the balance of influence. My husband's attempts to regain credibility through awkward gestures, whispered explanations, or fleeting expressions of charm only underscored the gap between his intentions and reality. The power he thought he wielded was gone. The mistress, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the consequences of her complicity. Her confidence had eroded completely, replaced by the anxiety of someone who realized that her perceived advantage was entirely dependent on a man now stripped of both social and moral authority. The room's attention, once partially on her, had shifted entirely to the presence of integrity and dignity embodied in me. I had not spoken a word, yet the silent authority I carried spoke volumes more than any confrontation ever could. In the midst of this, I experienced a profound realization. Betrayal, while painful, had provided an opportunity for transformation and clarity. By maintaining composure and patience, I had shifted the narrative entirely. The room acknowledged my strength, the guests' whispers and glances reaffirmed my position, and even my husband, now humbled, could not ignore the shift. The balance of power, which he had so carelessly attempted to manipulate, had realigned with a justice that was subtle yet absolute. The evening ended not with dramatic confrontation but with quiet acknowledgement. Dignity, patience, and composure had triumphed over deception, audacity, and superficial charm. My husband and his mistress were left to reconcile with the consequences of their choices, while I emerged as the silent victor. Standing poised, composed, and aware of the room's respect, I understood that true power was never about control through manipulation. It was about integrity, presence, and the quiet assurance that comes from standing unwavering, even in the face of betrayal.